Well, let's talk a little bit about ground covers, alternative ground covers for lawns. And I'm going to narrow this down a little bit as well. And so I'm going to focus kind of on some mixed species lawn. And this is a continuation of some work really that kind of started with Brooke Moffus in Treveries, and we kind of took it and ran with it in more of a replicated sense. But when I talk about mixed species lawns, obviously, these have the potential to reduce inputs while increasing ecosystem services. We've really only focused on one piece today, and that's been water conservation. And so I was asking earlier, a group over there, do you have a quarter? Because I had a dime, and a dime's not big enough, right? But there's two sides to the coin, right? And we've been focusing on one side of that coin. All the presentations have focused on the conservation side. We've really not focused on the quality side. Okay, and we could have an entire summit on the water quality side. And so I want to bring that into play. But when we think about water filtration and carbon storage and biodiversity conservation and all of these attributes, and the acceptance of these mixed species, is Laura, she spoke about the acceptance of water conservation strategies or that. But really, all of this is predicated on performance and aesthetic value and our willingness for people to kind of cross these norms as well. And so when we think about refuge lawn, this is a group out of Mississippi State. They got federal funding basically to convince people that weeds are okay. And so we look at that, the use of turf grass, rest assured, is not disappearing, but the way it looks and functions in the built environment is changing. And what's really interesting is you could poll the turfgrass scientists in this room or our colleagues across the country, and they will tell you the number one problem in the urban landscape is over irrigation. And then you come to a state like Florida, where we get on average 50 inches of rain a year. It's just the wheels are falling off of this thing. And it's not a plant problem. This is a people problem. And so the refuge lawn questions whether diverse turfgrass settings, indeed weedy lawns, can benefit insect pollinators. Well, insect pollinators are a really cool thing unless you're that 5 to 7% of the US population that carries an EpiPen. Right? I mean, they don't want this stuff in their lawn because they're freaked out by this stuff. And so microclavers, on my little walkabout yesterday in Butler Plaza, or whatever we call it now, it's amazing. It's mostly Bahia grass, and except next to the steakhouse, and they got like 6-inch tall zoysia grass, which is a problem. And but all kinds of these clovers and different, legume species are popping into these things. And so I think it's something to look at. So let me introduce you to Augustine Boeri. He just finished his PhD with me. He's now a newly minted PhD at assistant professor at Texas A&M, continuing what he's been doing here in a state that gets like no rain. And so his PhD work, which was largely unfunded, so there's about a $350,000 investment in this effort of looking at these mixed species. And so this one is kind of what some would consider, the really weedy thing, lots of different species in there. But we really took it kind of a different way. And we've been looking at these legume turfgrass mixtures kind of in this sense of saying, okay, we still need places for the kids to run and play and places for little bitty dogs to walk and do their thing, not these really tall type of landscapes. And so we've been looking at mixing legumes that bring about some benefits of themselves of fixing nitrogen and then mixing them up with turf grasses, especially those that requires terrible word, need lower nutritional inputs. And these mixed species are much more commonly used in forage systems and ag. And so we've looked at perennial peanut. Most people don't realize there's really kind of two perennial peanuts. There's the rhizomatous perennial peanut and then the stoloniferous perennial peanut. So you're familiar with terms like ecoturf, and we see it really all over the Gainesville campus. There's a lot and a beautiful mixed species, and most of these are the rhizomatous, so the below ground plant portions. And so we have a big linear gradient irrigation facility where in the middle of the facility, we can generate 120% of the plant need irrigation wise all the way out to zero. And then Augustine went in and was mixing, planting these amongst centipede grass, Bahia grass, St. Augustine grass. And what do they do over this range of too much water to not enough water? But we can see it's interesting when you put some of these, especially the rhizomatous legumes, into these mixes. aesthetically, you still see some green. And so our eyes kind of say, hey, that's not so bad. You know, if it was just turf grass alone, it's pretty brown and doesn't look so great. And so that consumer acceptance side of these things are probably increasing. This to me is really cool. And so this was a picture I took down in Naples at the beach club before it was bulldozed. And so this is Empire Zoysia. So that brings that kind of that gray green hue and then mixes it with these lavenders. Flowers. Now, creeping mimosa, I think, is probably one of those that maybe ought to be shifted over to that really a problem to kill. I told Augustine I wasn't signing his dissertation until he eradicated all of that junk from the research book. But it's cool, but it lacks some traffic tolerance. You can see where along the sidewalk's edge as people, you know, were walking, but that's pretty cool looking, right? And kids can still play on that. I mean, and little dogs can still do their thing. As well. Now, you remember that cleaning we were talking about? We've been focused on the water conservation side, but if we flip it over and look at the water quality side, what's interesting, this is nutrient leaching. And what's fascinating is the orange line that's really all over the place, up high above all those other lines. That's what happens when we start mulching landscape areas. That's nutrient leaching coming out of mulch. Right? There's no plants in that system to assimilate those nutrients that are being mineralized from the mulch that has been incorporated. Those other lines there are plant systems. We look at water use. Interestingly, we just because we're not irrigating it doesn't mean those plants aren't using water. They're pumping water out of the ground to support themselves. Most plants are what, 85% water? And so you look at that green line that's up above all those others, those are mixed forbs. Now, these aren't being irrigated, they are, because from a research standpoint, but then you see the mixed species, the legume and the turf and all that, versus the mulch down there. And so water use, these plants are still using water. There just isn't a fool running a sprinkler system, right? I mean, they're still pulling water out of the system. And so we haven't even touched Augustine's work focused on groundwater recharge. You start taking certain plant systems out of the landscape, and Evan just talked about how the soil building properties of plants in the landscape. You start taking plants out of a landscape, groundwater recharge becomes a real problem. Texas frog fruit's an interesting one. Dr. Kenworthy will speak to this. He's his breeding program on this frog fruit thing. You can head out to California, get you an In-N-Out burger, and you can see this carabia everywhere. This is Texas frog fruit. Now, I have a question for some folks that are involved with Sunbridge, because I was looking at the plant lists, and for some reason, frog fruit has been crossed off of that list. Not sure why. It's a native, but anyway, it's one that our team at UF has been working on quite a bit. So Tal mentioned this graphic, and I really think that this has got to be at the forefront. I showed this, I think it was last year. And so we think about we're probably not doing enough of this bucket here, people's priorities and preferences, the work that Dr. Warner is doing and others, because it ultimately comes down to what do people want, right? And shifting some of that, the biodiversity environment, the blue bucket. There's a tremendous effort in this realm. Basil's team working on a lot of this, the plant palette side. Okay, so those that are providing the plants that are used in these landscapes, and then there's some massive folks here and others that are in the maintenance side of things. I mean, if we can't we talk about this monoculture of turf grass, and people will hiss when they say that, right? I mean, it's like so bad, but I've not found a monoculture of turf grass yet. I mean, that might be the goal of some people, but the reality is we've got all kinds of stuff going in that landscape other than the desired species. And so how do you maintain a mixed species? Because we live in Florida, right? And we've got more weeds than people probably. I mean, and so how do you manage those things? And so we can generate all kinds of recommendations that become a real bear to maintain in that urban landscape. And so I keep this up there just because I think that future landscape is kind of this amalgamation of all of this coming together. And if we just get in our little silos and we focus on just one piece, we'll overemphasize that one piece at the expense of these others. And so I'm done.